All right, so let's talk about the SPED and SSRV files. And again, this isn't data population. We're not trying to rehash what was presented in Fall 1. So we're just going to point over some of the key data that comes out of those files. So of course, you have your District of Special Education Accountability. This is always a big one because although very frequently those who report the services are also the District of Special Education Accountability, that is not the rule. And so when you have a situation where a student is receiving services between multiple districts or as a resident of a district and receives services somewhere else, maybe the COE is involved, you have these different nuances. And so, I mean, not the inception, but very close to the inception of Students with Disability Reporting CalPADs, we were given Flash 161, and at the bottom, I'm sorry, I'll go more directly. There's a table, reporting data for students with disabilities in the CalPAD user manual. If you go to resources, you come down to reporting data for students with disabilities, there's a table, and it tells you whether or not, if you have one of these situations and you're trying to figure out who should be the District of Special Education Accountability, it has maybe 30 different scenarios. If your scenario isn't in there, you can submit a ticket, but for the most part, it's a great guide and it can really help you. And remember, the dashboard, even if you're the reporting LEA, if you're not this District of Special Education Accountability, that students' indicators are going to show up on the dashboard under the District of Special Education Accountability. So there is an extract, the District of Special Education Accountability extract. For many months, it wasn't working, but now I think it does. So you might want to take that extract and, review your students with disability and see who the District of Special Education Accountability is and if that's correct. And then we have our special education meeting types. And so, all of this is relevant for the next several months, right? We do know there's changes on the horizon, but for end of year 4, the special education meetings are important. And in particular, when you talk about reporting certification, because only your annuals and your evaluations, those formerly triennial meetings, right? So your initials and your plan meetings are going to show up on reports. Your evaluations will not. So keep that in mind. And if you're new, in terms of reporting, evaluations and plan meetings are held one and the same. But for reporting purposes, they have to be identified individually. So you may, in the same setting, maybe a convenience to the family, convenience to the staff involved, evaluate the student's eligibility as well as prescribe services going forward. That would consist of 2 meetings, right? That would be 40 and a 20, right? And that would look like an annual and a triennial or a plan review and evaluation. So, in terms of coming out of the SPED file, the special education meeting type is very important, especially when you're looking at records on reports. And then the education plan type, this is important as well, right? We have our IFSP for the infants and toddlers, age 3 and below, the IEP for students age 3 to 5, IEP for students who are as young as 3 and go up to the age out at 22, so 3 to 21, and the ISP for those same ages for students in private school. So one of the things that I wanted to point out, and this is one of the biggest problems when we're reporting data for students with disabilities, on the enrollment side, is reporting the right enrollment status for our students. So this table has been here forever. It still gives accurate guidance, right? It'll change a little bit again with SPED redesign coming in the fall, but for right now, we need to know a few things. So just real quickly, required meeting types, right? Birth to 22. I don't want to look at the meeting types, but this table tells you the different type of programs they can have. 3 to 22, you can see the IEP and ISP. And that's because this is Flash 161. If you look at this table, and this guidance is still relevant, your infants and toddlers could have that enrollment status 50, and that's it, right? Your preschool students have a primary enrollment, and this is where we get a lot of problem, is because we're thinking of preschool students not understanding that they're on an IEP, not an IFSP. right? And so the 50 enrollment status should only be for students who are on IFSPs. If they have an IEP, they should be primary enrollment, enrolled at a school in the district or the district, and that starts at 3 years old. And so because of the age level, we group these students together, but there's a distinct difference for those preschool students, and we can't say that enough. And then again, you can use the non-ADA enrollment status 50 for students enrolled at a private school. They have to have a private school of attendance code, though, 6 zeros followed by that lone 2. And so this is where we get a lot of errors. A lot of errors come back to the marriage between education plan type and enrollment status or school of attendance. And so again, it's in the data guide. The data guide hasn't been updated in years, but this is in the data guide. It's also in Flash 161. And then, of course, we have our disability categories, right? These are the reasons why our students are receiving services. Nothing's changed here since the inception. Maybe changes coming again in the future, but as of right now, these are determined by the federal government, IDEA. So it's not state. There's no wiggle room. So the primary disability has to be one of these codes to justify students' eligibility of services. And then special education program setting, the special education program setting code just describes the environment in which the student is receiving services. When you talk about least restrictive environment, it's going to be looking at this code here. And I think the valid code combinations document, comes into play because you can see we have an education plan program setting table. And so 100 being IEP, 150 being IFSP, 200 being the ISPs, right? You can see that while home setting is good for our IEP, is good for our IFSP, it's not a good setting for your ISP, right? And I've kind of highlighted 14 and 15 because you're going to have most likely some errors attributed to students who have a record and they have a 103, 104. They need to update their setting. And so one of the things Kyra and I were talking about is we want to make sure everybody understands the nuance with this. The scenario will be the student has either changed settings or went to a new plan type, and this field hasn't been updated. So if they've gone to a new plan type, if you've gone from an IFSP to IEP, you need to delete the IEP record and submit the record with an appropriate setting. Beforehand, it would have prevented that data from coming to CalPads. Now it's a CDD, so the data is going to be in CalPads. The only way to update that record is to delete and remove it. If you have a program setting problem because the student has reached age 3, possibly age 5, and they need to be in a school age setting, right? You need to submit an amendment on that student's birthday with the new setting. You can't submit a new record and leave the existing record alone. You have to amend the existing record because what will happen is that existing record is still going to overlap that student's birthday if you don't submit an amendment on that student's birthday. And that error will still trigger even though you may have a new amendment or a new record submitted for the student. Even if the meeting is held after the student's birthday, the student turned, say, 5 in March and needs a school age setting, and you have a meeting in April, you still have to amend that meeting because that period from March to April, that record's going to trigger an error. And I think that SPED, Kyra, talk about the SPED 362. That might be the one that comes to mind. I mean, I wrote a note, so I'm kind of lying. That is the one, but it's neither here nor there. And then again, I was talking about the school age setting, right? When students who are 5 and enrolled in kindergarten, they have to be in a school age setting. Students with that combination, see that a lot in fall 1, right? Students may be in kindergarten first and then turn 5 because the way TK was handled. But then sometimes students will be 5 and then come to kindergarten later. So it just depends when their birthday falls. But this update is either on their birthday or when they start kindergarten. They have to update their setting with an amendment. It's on their birthday or the day they enrolled in kindergarten. And that's whenever they met the second of the 2 criterias. And then general education percentage range code, right? If you're in a school age setting, you also have to tell us what percentage time you're participating in general education, right? And so that's code 1 would be equal to or greater than 80% of the time. 2 would be between 40 and 79% of the time. And 3 would be less than 40% of the time. Again, we mentioned this because students turn 5, and this is also an indication that has to be updated in an amendment. Becomes a loop when you don't know all the different criteria, the nuance of reporting. So 1, typically at this time of year, it's going to be students turning 5. And then once they turn 5 and in kindergarten, you want to make sure that you update that they're in an appropriate school age setting. These are going to be your TK students possibly because they're going to have grade level KN, but they were allowed to enroll when they were 4. So again, you submit an amendment on their birth date. You want to update their special education program setting, as well as the general education participation percentage range code. And then transition service indicator, again, it can be submitted before they turn 16, but by the time they turn 16, you want to update this again, because it's related to that student's age and their birthday. Any student that's turning 16, that's a student with disability, CalPEDS is going to start looking for this indicator to be populated. They don't have to be receiving services. You just have to indicate whether they are or whether they're not. And then that's it for this special education program. The SPED file, let's talk about some of the services. The service code, of course, is the most significant part of information. And, we're telling what assistance, what special education related services the student is being provided. And then we need to identify the provider, right? It could be a county office, younger children, perhaps a regional center, be a SELPA, the school itself can be providing the services. So we want to identify who's the provider of the services. And then the frequency and duration, how long and how often these special education related services are being provided. And one of the important things about a service record, of course, is the special education meeting or amendment identifier. This will tie the services to the program record, that matching identifier. When you're troubleshooting multiple special education or service records, certification screen will present the meeting identifier. You want to copy that, and then when you go look at the student's record, you paste it in the find, so you can find which record. Some of our students have many services or many special education program records. So you want to be, astutely aware. You're looking for a specific record to identify it by its meeting amendment ID.